And Allison, thank you very much for the introduction as well as the invitation from the organizers. I have to tell you that I very much enjoy all of these conferences, and it doesn't matter whether it's a workshop, a symposium, or a larger conference. I think I have yet to come away from one of these events where I didn't take something back to our operation, whether it was a new technology, a new strategy. So I guess that's my goal today as I speak to you for the next few minutes, is hopefully I'm going to leave you with something that is unique to our operation. It may be something to try, it may be something not to try, but that's the hope, is that you'll have some concept to think about in a little bit of a different way. The other thing that I really enjoy is the fact that I'm on the panel with Ken. So I've actually had a chance to hear Ken speak a couple of times. And what I enjoy and appreciate about his presentation is the detail. The amount of data that's been collected over a number of years. It's not something that I can supply that many years of data per se. I'm behind you, Ken, by a decade or so in terms of the number of years that we've used cover crops. But I like that pragmatic approach in terms of being able to analyze it. And the other thing is that I think that, Ken is like a good face for production agriculture from a size and from a technology perspective. And I think you'll find that we agree on a lot of things in terms of approach or concepts, strategies, as well as outcomes. But I approach it from a slightly different lens. And that lens is from somebody who's a little bit smaller in terms of size. So our operation is just a little bit under 900 acres. And we actually row crop less than half of that. So we're basically in cattle country, so we have a cow-calf operation as well. And the other aspect is that I actually have off-farm employment. So I'm really happy to see all the folks in the seats out there. Anybody else besides myself have that issue where we have off-farm employment. And so our farming operation sometimes is dictated. Let's show of hands so I can see who else I'm speaking with. Okay, so probably 20% of the group here is in the same category as me, where sometimes timing is an issue. And I think you'll see some of these aspects start to shine through in terms of the decisions that we're making in terms of how we're integrating cover crops into our operation. So today what I would like to be able to do is tell you a little bit about our operation, how we've integrated cover crops on a profitable basis. I'd like to get into what I call the balancing economic gain, which is essentially those short-term outflows in terms of cash flow balanced with the revenue side of the equation. And then the last thing, just a few questions or a few points, what I call playing the long game, which is where I hope it's a jump off into a discussion for the group, as long as we have enough time, Allison, to be able to talk about things not today, but 5 or 6 or 8 or 10 years from now, what the cover crop picture may look like. Just some things to start thinking a little bit further down the road. Our farm, as introduced, I'm from Missouri, so we actually are about halfway between St. Louis and Kansas City and south of I-70. When I was growing up, I always heard my father introduce us to somebody that wasn't in agriculture as explaining the fact that we actually grew up in the laplands of Missouri. And so that's where the rocks of the Ozarks laps over top the good soil of Saline County. So by definition, we're probably better cattle country than anything else. And our creek bottoms that we have are flooded usually about every year. It's a quick flood up and down, heavy clay content in terms of the soils, but a lot of really rolling terrain in terms of the hill ground. I've told the story before, but I was only about 40 miles away from where I went to college. And so on weekends, I would have what I would call to myself a Tom Sawyer party, where I would bring somebody with me home trying to get a little bit of work out of them. And I could point to the exact part of the blacktop when we moved south of I-70, coming towards our farm, especially in the fall. I would hear this comment, "Wow, that's beautiful." Now, getting a compliment about scenery is great, but it tells you what the farming is like in that area, because it's all the bluffs and the rolling terrain that they were making a comment on. So that's where I farm with my father. He is retired at this point in time, but the two of us, no additional labor that's there. In terms of the cover crops that we're using, 2 or 3 times throughout the day-to-day, I'm going to point to something I've really enjoyed and appreciated. SARE and CTIC has done an annual survey for a number of years. I love the information and data that's coming off of this survey, especially because it's been done for a number of years to give us some nice benchmarks. But, folks are adopting cover crops for a number of reasons. This just gives you an idea. This is actually 14 and 15. It doesn't have the 16 data in it. In terms of why individuals are adopting cover crops, it was interesting to me is that when I started discussing bringing cover crops back into the farm a number of years ago, my father and I came at it from different perspectives, but eventually, we got to the point of agreeing upon why we needed to integrate cover crops back in. And for our soils, it's all about water. Year in, year out, that is our biggest limiting factor in terms of yields. If I can point to 2014, it's a year, at least in Missouri, that we remember from a corn standpoint, that was the year in which everything was just right. And so even on our soils, 230 bushel corn on 150 units of N, but year in, year out, our limiting factor is water. So having that water holding capacity, you heard Dan Sutter mention it today in the session, you've heard Ken mention it as well. That's really from a long-term perspective, our number one goal. Secondary to that though, and coming back to our operation, half of it or less being row cropped, that really having additional forage quality. Saw another producer this morning from Missouri, and we were laughing at Missouri producers as to how much money we spend in capital and fuel and labor rolling up hay, not even high quality hay and fescue, just to feed them during the winter. So that was almost as important, especially from a short-term perspective, that we wanted to make sure to find a way to be able to have additional forage. And I'm going to prove Ken's point that it's if you have a cow-calf operation with cover crops, it's really easy to justify from an economic perspective. Now, I don't want to belittle the rest of them. They're all also important in terms of soil erosion, weed and pest pressures, as well as water infiltration. But those are probably the top two elements that really impact our decisions. So these are the cover crops we're currently using. Red clover, cereal rye, winter canola. I think probably might have a couple of you scratching your heads, so I'm going to spend a little bit more time talking about why winter canola we brought that into our mix. And then also some mixes. One of the first things that those of you that have experience are probably going to point out is that if increasing the water holding capacity of our soils is my number one priority, there's probably better ways than these cover crops to get there, at least in a quicker vein. And my comment will be is that we're going to get there. It's a year-on-year building experience, and this was the way that we were starting to integrate those in. So again, kind of referring back to prior surveys done by SARE and CTIC, the only reason I point this out is that at least in the surveys which have been done, a lot of times the issue of labor and management comes up as the number one challenge to be able to integrate cover crops in. I am definitely no different. I travel with my job. Mother Nature and my travel schedule never seem to agree with each other. And when we get into corn harvest, just my father and I, and we're 22 miles away from an elevator. So in corn harvest, one's on a combine, one is running a semi, and it's just back and forth. It takes a lot of discipline to convince yourself to climb off of that combine that cover crops are important and you have to take the time to be able to go get those seeded in a timely manner. So just a little bit about how we're doing it and implement it in our operation. So Ken and the rest of the no-tillers, you have to close your eyes here. We do use a vertical till tool. So right after harvest, we'll run that across the corn stalks. We've used a number of different techniques to be able to seed, everything from a drill to a plane. What you see in the upper right-hand corner there is actually just our little Kinsey split row planter. I'm actually planting canola there, trying to keep my seeding rate down using milo plates. But in the end, because labor is our largest constraint, because of off-farm employment, we have actually moved back to using a pendulum spreader, and we've used that for 2 or 3 years now. And actually, at least from my perspective, I feel like that we've had really good success. So the pictures you're going to see are all from a pendulum spreader. It allows me to get over 3 times as many acres in terms of speed, and so it's enabled us to make sure that we get cover crops on every acre of corn that's out there. So this is fall growth in terms of cereal rye. We will graze. If we get the cereal rye on early enough, we'll actually fall graze it. It's great in terms of withstanding that pressure. And then come back the following spring prior to termination, and we'll graze it again. And winter canola, anybody in the audience actually ever used winter canola specifically thinking of it as a cover crop for grazing? There we go. I'm not the only person here. So I actually was at a meeting of the U.S. Canola Association. A gentleman there from the University of Georgia was actually looking to see whether or not they could get grazing off of the canola as well as a canola crop. So, canola moved into the Great Plains, Oklahoma, as well as Kansas, and there's also a push towards more canola acres in the southeastern United States as well. But what intrigued me was just the quality of the forage. in terms of the protein content. So what we've done on our farm is every year we'll plant where we have our main cow operation. We'll make sure we plant an early season corn. So we'll go with 102-day corn versus 112 or 114. It's great because it lets us get that off that first field. We find everything that broke on the combine during the winter as it sat in the shed. And then we're able to come right back in because canola really needs to be planted by the 15th or 20th of September. We have planted as late as the 28th. This is the year we planted it on the 28th of September. And although we didn't have as much grazing potential as we would like, we did end up having about 5 inches of grazing. After it has the hard freeze, it increases the palatability, and then we'll be able to move those cows in about December to be able to graze that off. So following spring, it's basically standard operating procedure in terms of the way that we would plant no matter what. We'll do a burn down, something like a generic glyphosate mixed with a residual, and then come in and we'll no-till beans. So whether it's after canola or whether it's after rye, it's really the same. This is from this year, so the upper left is after cereal rye. The lower right is just a picture of harvest. Interesting from a harvest perspective, our yields this year range from 47 to 61. Highest yielding was after a field of cereal rye. Second highest yielding farm, our field was after winter canola as a cover crop. Roundup Ready 2 for the highest, or Roundup Ready 1, believe it or not, was the second highest yielding. And after that, it was really mixed, with really no differentiation between the yields as far as that goes. So that gives you an idea of what we do from an economic perspective. The main thing that I wanted to be able to point out with this particular slide is just the fact that we look at everything on an enterprise basis. We try to be as honest as possible, including everything in terms of machinery depreciation and allocation in terms of the amount of labor that it would take. These are just my baseline budgets that I would work up on an annual basis. In this case, I'm using 2016 returns, and then in just a second, we'll see kind of what adding the cover crop in means in terms of additional impacts in terms of cash flow. So from a cash flow perspective, and this is where, as Ken said, everybody can debate how you look at your economics. From my perspective, I'm going to run those stocks whether I have covers or not. And so to me, that's a sunk cost, so it's not something I allocate in terms of additional cash flow. In terms of the seeding operation, again, I'm using a low horsepower tractor that sits. Otherwise, I still include depreciation on that anyway, but it's low horsepower, covering 15 acres an hour, and so it's a really cheap way to be able to seed. And from a cost standpoint, that's an allocation of about 45 pounds per acre for cereal rye in the mid-20s in terms of the cost. Some years, especially where we see some cyst or some nematode pressure, we'll add in high uric acid rapeseed. The cost of winter canola is a little bit higher, but not that much different in terms of seeding costs. Again, when it comes to cash flow, I'm going to terminate that crop the next spring regardless, and so I consider that a sunk cost, unless I've got clover in the mix, in which I'll probably have to put a little bit of additional chemical in terms of working. Glyphosate just doesn't necessarily work that well when it comes to clovers, and so I might put some 2,4-D or something like that. So from an input or a cash flow standpoint, we're talking about less than $20 an acre in terms of additional costs. A little bit different from what they've seen in terms of the annual survey. And I definitely think that this is well within range of what most people are looking at. I think if we were putting more of an effort into mixes, we would see our costs going a little bit higher as far as that goes. So the distinction for our operation, and again, I'm going to come back and hopefully just prove Ken correct, and that is that by having a cow-calf operation as part of the farm, it's allowed us to be able to, at least in my estimation, recoup all those expenses and more on an annual basis. So the two things that we've been grazing, one, winter canola, palatability perspective, if you haven't introduced your cows to canola, it will take a couple of days to get them there, but once they do, they find it very palatable. Fairly high in terms of protein, and the main thing to go with that is low in fiber, and so we actually have hay out there with it to give them a roughage source as well in addition to. And I'd already mentioned cereal rye in terms of both fall as well as spring grazing. The one aspect that I don't like about grazing is just having cattle on, and you have to be really particular, and sometimes Mother Nature doesn't agree with you as to when you want to graze versus the weather conditions. I know there's been some research out there basically showing that if you're doing a good job in terms of your covers, that the compaction isn't that much of an issue. But if nothing else, when you're coming back in and no-tilling in there, you have to pay more attention because in terms of seed placement and in terms of your seed stance. So if we look at this from an economic perspective, and I want to preface this by saying I should have put it in bold print on the slide in case people are looking at the slide without having the voiceover from today. From my perspective, this is about as conservative as you can be on the revenue side of the equation with the graze. So I discounted this as much as possible. Basically, I talked to a gentleman that works on the dairy side in terms of grazing dairies. For cereal rye, this is the example for cereal rye at least. He said, 250 to 350 pounds of biomass per inch for cereal rye. I'm planting at reduced seeding rates of only 45 pounds versus maybe 85, 95 pounds per acre for grazing. So I only took 150 pounds of biomass of credit per inch of grazing. And we're normally getting at least 6-7 inches of grazing potential out of that, but many years we'll get a lot more. So at a Missouri rate of $12 per animal unit month, we're talking about a credit of around $16 an acre. But I believe that's as conservative as it can be, especially when you think about the fact that we've reduced our hay usage by 22 to 25%, and every bale of hay that we do not have to put up is a savings. And if we can ever get to the point where we don't have to own a baler, I'll cherish that day in terms of cost. So at least from our perspective, this has been a wonderful addition on a short-term basis. And I also want to make sure that I know at the very bottom this doesn't include any benefits in terms of reductions of herbicide or fertilizer or any additional yield benefits. I'm strictly looking at cash in, cash out for somebody who's only been using cover crops for a few years. And that's really where I get to the next part, which is balancing those short-term and long-term expectations. So what I want to do is to show you that qualitatively, I know I'm getting these benefits, and then I need to take advantage of those in the long term from a cost standpoint as well. So from a wheat perspective, and these are just pictures of the winter canola on your left, and that's rye on the right. The pictures didn't show as much as I wanted to, but essentially anywhere we had a cover crop, we didn't have any winter annual weeds. In this case, it's primarily Hindbent. But even more important from my perspective is in one of the fields, I miscalculated, I did something wrong. I had a 30-acre patch that ended up with, I was short on seed last year. So I ended up having my own strip trial. And what was interesting to me was when we came back across, and this has glyphosate and Envive as the burn down of the residual, is the fact that the rye was on your left-hand side. On the right-hand side is where I ran short of seed. And this is after burn down. As you see, there's Roundup-resistant mare's tail on the right-hand side. There's absolutely none on the left-hand side. So I was traveling, I just barely threw back, we were running behind. I have a neighbor that's always looking for something to do. So he was in planting on this particular field. It did not take very long for my father to get a phone call. What did you guys do? Why is there mare's tail here and not there? I think he's going to plant cover crops next year. So, that's the quickest way to convert somebody. I would say that we haven't necessarily reduced our herbicide program at this point in time. Somebody needs just to push me that last little bit. This year was the first year we walked and walked and walked, trying to make the decision as to whether or not we needed to spray post. It was so clean in terms of the field. So we left a 90-acre pass, and it looked like in the end we could have gotten by without spraying post-emerge this year. Anybody here, can you identify what this particular tool is? You're going to get the high-tech from Ken, and this is low-tech from Alan. Anybody? You're not going to get it, so does this help anybody? So this is my father's genius way of being able to test my theories on compaction. So that's actually just from a wheel rake, and then he welded a ball bearing on the end of it. But just to give you an idea from a compaction how much we're happy with cover crops. In that same 30-acre field, that's about 14 inches. It's 14 inches all the way down where we had cover crops. And we obviously at the 4 to 6 inch line, we had some issues in terms of pushback whenever we were looking at it otherwise. So, from a compaction standpoint, I think that in a low-tech way, it really proves that point. Soil erosion, Ken already touched on this topic. Luckily, this is not a picture of our field per se. The one thing I would like to add on soil erosion is one of the jobs that I hate the worst of anything is loading the Bobcat up and then taking it to a farm to have to spend half a day or a day backfilling terraces and everything else. Where we continuously had good use of cover crops, the amount of time that we have spent has decreased significantly. We still had some terrace overs where we had big rain events, but it's been decreased significantly. And I think that's something else that we can add into that short-term analysis in terms of costs going out. So benefits over time, these are all the things that I didn't account for necessarily in that short-term cash flow analysis earlier. It's things that as I get to that point where Ken is in 10 and 15 and 20 years, that I have no doubt that I'm going to take advantage of. And just supported, by the way, with other research which is out there. I thought this was great. If anybody hasn't necessarily seen the work that was sponsored by the National Association of Conservation Districts, it looked at several case studies. And in every case, they found some of these same things on their particular farm. And the last one there is the one we're really trying to get to, which is the increase in terms of revenue coming from yields. And again, referencing some survey work from SARE and ASTA and CTIC, that those benefits do accrue in the years 2, 3, 4, and 5. And that's what we're trying to get to that point where we do see the increases in terms of yield, where we've got covers versus no covers. So I guess the last thing that I really wanted to get to is kind of morphing off into looking into the future and playing the long game in terms of thoughts and concepts. 2012 is starred there. That was, I think, the first year that CTIC and SARE sponsored this survey. And of course, coming back, some of those yield increases were very significant in terms of individuals that had used covers versus no covers. And I think we have a really good understanding as why. But that gets me to the point of thinking about some of these concepts that I'd like to bounce us off into in terms of a discussion. And it's thinking into the future, 5 or 6 or 10 years. What does it mean from a risk management standpoint? Are there things out there that we're not calling cover crops today that we might call cover crops in the future? What impact, coming back to the question that was asked, does this have in terms of land value? And then also, the concept of voluntary versus regulatory. One of the things that I work on in my day job deals with regulations. And so this is one of those things that we can proactively look at. So coming back to that slide in terms of 2012, to me that was a defining moment in terms of the impact, in terms of resiliency, risk management, in terms of the use of cover crops. And interesting enough, we, and I didn't even highlight it back in terms of our enterprise budgets, but we don't take crop insurance on our farm. We've done the math year in, year out. We don't think it necessarily pays, and this is our answer to crop insurance. This is what we're working towards in terms of resiliency. And I think that when you listen to individuals like Dan DeSutter and others, you can see why that has a really good chance in the future of being our option in terms of crop insurance. And again, this is just some information coming from that survey in 2012, highlighting that in those 7 states that were significantly impacted by the drought, where you saw even more significant increases in terms of yield. Switching gears just quickly, as Allison knows, my other life, my day job is actually in the area of biofuels. And so one of the things that I work on is looking at oil seeds or other feedstocks. So if we think about the future, we think about breeding that can be done. Interesting enough, I was at a meeting last week speaking with a farmer. So I'm at a meeting on biofuels, and we started talking about cover crops and soil health. I think that's a good start. The second thing was, he's like, Alan, just give me something that generates nitrogen, and I want not more than 50 or 70 pounds by April 15th. And so you can see that he was thinking, though, and I think that's what we need to do. We need to put those scientist years into the breeding aspects of cover crops to fit into our rotations. That's something I think that we can work towards. Separate and distinct from, this is actually a slide courtesy of Arbogenics, which is a private company working to develop field pennycress, which a lot of you, I'm sure, know what pennycress is. Many of us have actually had to terminate it as a weed in our fields. But they're working from a breeding perspective to look at the concept of aerially applying seed and standing corn, having it mature in mid to late May, and still come in to be able to have soybeans as a full season crop with very little yield drag. Something that would generate additional vegetable oil supplies, in this case looking at the biofuels industry. But this crop is really a cover crop from the perspective of being able to actually scavenge the nutrients which are in the soil, to reduce soil erosion, to keep a living plant on the soil. So I guess what I'm encouraging everyone to do is to not think just about today, but to think into the future, 5 to 10 years from now, about where we might be. And then the last thing that I'd like to end on is something that I believe will happen. And I believe that we will be looking in the future at land value. What are land values or rent values? It's just looking at annual cash flows added together and discounted back in terms of net present value. And that's really what we think of when we think of land, or how we should think of the value of land. So there's no reason why in the future that we will not see land valuations hinged or pulled together as it relates back to soil health and soil organic matter. But to me, that would be a great way to end in terms of discussion point. I was trying to give Allison a bouncing off point in case there was others in the crowd that disagreed. But with that, I appreciate your time in terms of listening to some of the things that we're doing on our operation, and specifically how we've integrated cow-calf operation into grazing cover crops, and how from our perspective economically it's almost why could you not do cover crops. So thank you.